Imagine the roads twisting away from Richmond in late October when the leaves burn gold and orange across the rolling hills of Virginia. The morning sun sits low, throwing long shadows through the windshield as Emily Hart drums her fingers on the door and hums along to the radio. Jason Brooks drives with one hand on the wheel, his eyes cutting to her with a lazy grin. They are escaping the city in a rust-speckled Subaru that smells like coffee and old hiking boots, both determined to make a memory no one else would understand. Their plan is simple. They want 3 days away from the buzzing phones, the cramped apartment, and the dull routine that turns even love stale if you let it. This is not their first trip into the woods together, but this time feels different. Emily clutches a folded road atlas that is dog-eared at every state line while Jason squints at the green signage on the highway shoulder. They talk about the camping spots they might pick along the Blue Ridge, but keep returning to the same reckless idea. There is an old trail that nobody uses anymore cutting deep into the western hills. It is not on the official maps. Jason heard about it at work from a maintenance guy who claimed it led to an old coal mining road where you could park and have the mountains all to yourself. Emily laughs when he describes it. She wants that feeling of being somewhere no one else has ever been. They leave messages before they go. Emily's mother gets a quick call that morning with an airy promise to text from camp if they have service. Jason's brother gets a one-line message about not waiting up for them until Monday. The messages are not really for safety. They are for courtesy. Both believe nothing bad can happen in a world so familiar, so American, so tamed. Their supplies are packed with predictable thoroughness. There are 2 cheap sleeping bags, a bright orange tent that leaks if the rain is heavy enough, a camping stove that always smells faintly of fuel, and enough bottled water to drown an elephant. Jason checks the list twice, while Emily takes photos of the parking lot for no reason but to mark the start of their weekend. As they roll west, the land opens into a patchwork of fields and distant peaks. The Subaru hums up the old two-lane roads and slips through small towns where gas stations have dusty windows and the grocery stores are half empty at midday. At one of these stops, they ask a cashier if the old mine roads are really passable, and the old man squints at them before shaking his head slowly. He says people get lost up there every year. Emily thanks him, turns, and laughs with Jason at the warning. It is just local color to them. Another bit of small-town gloom that cannot touch their big city confidence. Jason fills the tank and buys a map nobody will really use. They share a candy bar in the parking lot and look at each other like they have everything they need. By late afternoon, they are miles beyond the last big sign of civilization. The road shrinks to cracked blacktop lined with fallen branches. A mailbox leans at a defeated angle, nameplate worn blank. The hills rise tighter around them, and the cell signal fades without fanfare. Emily takes out her camera to capture the way the light slants through bare trees, the long pale shapes cast like ghostly fingers across the hood of the car. She grins at Jason, who is concentrating too hard on avoiding potholes. They are not lost yet, but they both feel it in the air. The smell of cold earth. The hush that follows the wind in hollows, so deep the sun never really touches them. They are smiling, but quieter now. They stop one last time on the shoulder of the road, where a rusted sign barely reads, "State property, no trespassing." Jason kills the engine. They listen to the creak of the car, settling in the cool evening. The map is spread across Emily's knees, and they trace lines no one has driven in years. They are looking for adventure, for privacy, for the promise of being utterly alone. They do not talk about the warnings. They do not mention the way the road seems to end in brambles a mile ahead. Instead, they hold hands and agree silently to be reckless just this once. He starts the car, and the sound is too loud in the silence of the hills. As the sun sinks behind the ridge, the Subaru noses onto a forgotten track covered in dead leaves and washed-out gravel. There is no fanfare, no dramatic turn, just a quiet choice made in the stillness of a backroad evening. They want to see what no one else bothers to see. The road narrows until the branches scrape the roof. Emily rolls down her window to feel the air turning colder with a dying light. Jason leans forward, alert for dips and rocks. They are laughing again. They think the danger is half the fun. Somewhere behind them, the main road curves safely back toward Richmond. Out here, the dark has already settled in the gullies, and the first stars are showing themselves overhead. And in that moment, everything seems right. Two people alone in the world they have chosen. The road behind them fades, and the one ahead bends out of sight. The camera rests on Emily's lap. The map slides to the floor. The world seems huge, empty, and entirely theirs for the taking. They share a look that says this is what they wanted, and they keep driving deeper into the hills, unaware that the path they have chosen has been waiting for them for years. The headlights carve narrow beams through the thickening forest as Jason slows the car to a crawl, squinting through the windshield where streaks of dirt catch the fading light. Emily leans forward, her hand pressed against the dashboard as the Subaru bumps over roots and rocks that have settled into the neglected road. They share a tight-lipped smile that is equal parts excitement and nerves. The GPS has long since given up, showing nothing but a pale grid with no roads marked, and their printed map is folded in her lap, tracing lines that do not seem to match what they see through the glass. They tell themselves that this is the best part, the adventure they promised each other, the chance to be truly alone, far from the noise of the city. At a crossroads that is more suggestion than a true split in the road, Jason brakes hard, and they argue lightly over which direction to take. Emily insists left because it seems less traveled and therefore more authentic. Jason grumbles that they will get stuck if the trail narrows further, but he turns the wheel anyway. The car shudders as it climbs a small rise and then dips sharply, scraping the undercarriage. They wince in unison but keep going. There is a tension in the air that neither acknowledges, the small fear that they might not be able to turn around. Emily keeps glancing back, watching the entrance to the forest vanish behind them as if the trees are swallowing the path whole. They pass a fallen sign half buried in moss and dead leaves, the paint long since weathered away to rust and splinters. Jason jokes that it probably once warned travelers to turn back while they still could. Emily does not laugh this time. She shifts in her seat and looks at him with a frown, asking if he really knows where they are going. He answers too quickly that they will find a clearing soon, a perfect campsite that no one else will even know exists. She opens the window a crack to let in the cold, damp smell of the woods and feels a shiver that has nothing to do with temperature. She hears something in the distance, a low grinding like wind through dead branches or maybe something else entirely, and she closes the window without saying anything. As twilight bleeds into full darkness, they realize they have no signal on their phones. Jason keeps checking his screen and then dropping it in the console with an annoyed sigh. Emily tries to lighten the mood by taking a picture of him with her camera, the flash too bright and jarring in the gloom. He squints at her and tells her to stop blinding him. The mood in the car is no longer easy or playful, but tight and uncomfortable. They have left behind the safety of well-marked trails and campgrounds. They are in a place where the trees are older than memory and the roads were never meant to welcome them. They stop at last on a patch of half-cleared dirt that is uneven and littered with broken branches. Jason kills the engine, and for a moment, they both listen to the sudden silence that follows. There are no other cars, no lights, no sounds but the sigh of wind through skeletal branches. Emily reaches for her water bottle, and her hand trembles just a little. Jason gets out and slams the door harder than necessary. He shines his cheap flashlight around, picking out shapes that look too much like lurking figures before resolving into trees and rocks. He tells her this is good enough, they will camp here for the night and figure out the rest tomorrow. She does not argue, but she hesitates before opening her door. They unload the car in silence, stacking gear beside the dirt patch. The tent is spread out, but they argue about where to place it because the ground is uneven and roots push up through the soil. Jason snaps at her to hold the pole steady, and she bites back tears. It is not what they imagined. They thought it would be romantic and quiet, a world stripped of everything but them. Instead it is cold, lonely, and feels like a mistake. But they keep going because turning back is harder than pressing on. They get the tent standing but crooked. Jason throws the sleeping bags inside, and Emily sits on the edge with her hands buried in her hair. Jason finally notices her shaking, and he sits beside her, pulling her close with an apology mumbled into her hair. She tells him she is just tired, that they both are, and tomorrow will be better. They share the last of the granola bars they had meant for the trail and drink lukewarm water from plastic bottles. Outside, the wind grows stronger, making the nylon of the tent rattle and twist. They both lie back in the dark, listening to the rustle of dead leaves against the ground and wonder if they will get any sleep at all. They do not speak about the old gas station attendant who warned them earlier that day in a low voice that the woods have a way of swallowing people. He told them the roads they were taking had not been maintained in decades, that the mines in the hills were dangerous even when they were open, that people went missing up there even now. Jason had laughed, playing the tough skeptic, while Emily had thanked the man politely and led Jason away before he could say anything else. Now in the tent with the wind pushing against the sides like unseen hands, she remembers the look in the old man's eyes, not angry or even frightened but resigned, as if he had seen this before. They lie awake for hours, Jason shifting restlessly, while Emily curls up on her side, facing the tent wall. Outside, the wind moans through the trees and sends a shudder through the thin fabric. She counts the seconds between gusts and focuses on her breathing. He reaches for her hand eventually, and she takes it. They do not say anything else, because they both know they have gone too far to turn back now. They listen to the forest and pretend that it is only the wind they hear, that the trees are not moving closer, that the dark is only night and nothing more. They hold hands until the cold numbs them and sleep finally takes them in fits and starts. The morning air is brittle and cold when Emily opens her eyes to the pale gray light filtering through the tent fabric. She shifts against the stiff ground and feels every root pressing through the thin foam pad. Jason is already awake, propped on an elbow, and staring at the rippling shape of the tent door as the wind moves it slightly. Neither speaks at first. They lie there listening to the sounds outside, the low scrape of branches, the distant thump of something falling in the woods. When they finally crawl out, they do not smile or make jokes. The clearing seems smaller in the weak light, the trees closer, the track they arrived on half hidden by drifts of dry leaves that fell overnight. Jason stands and stretches, rolling his shoulders like he is trying to shake something off. Emily rubs her eyes and looks at the sky, which is already a flat, unpromising white. They pack up slowly, arguing over small things. Jason folds the tent with angry snaps of the fabric, while Emily tries to keep the stakes organized. Their words get louder until they both fall silent and do the work with grim concentration. By the time everything is back in the Subaru, they are sweating in the chill, their breath fogging the air as they refuse to look at each other. Jason starts the car, and the engine catches with a complaining whine before settling into a rough idle. Emily pulls her seatbelt on and stares straight ahead as Jason mutters about checking the map again. The printed page looks even more useless in daylight, the roads twisting like veins without any clear landmarks. He shoves it into the glove compartment with a disgusted grunt. They drive slowly, the tires crunching over fallen branches and soft earth. Emily keeps her eyes on the trees as if they might catch something watching them back. Jason tries to hum tunelessly, but it dies in his throat. The GPS does not work at all. Their phones are silent bricks in their pockets. They come to another split in the trail, one direction looking more used with faint tire tracks, and the other overgrown. Emily points right, wanting to get out of the woods, but Jason insists left is shorter on the map. They argue again, voice rising before Jason shouts at her to trust him for once. She glares at him but says nothing. He turns left. The road closes in even tighter. Branches scrape along the car doors with nails-on chalkboard shrieks. Leaves flutter down like scraps of burnt paper. The Subaru dips and rocks over gullies that have no business on anything called a road. Emily braces her hands on the dash and hisses for him to slow down. Jason mutters that they will get out of it, that it is all part of the adventure. She asks if he even remembers which way they came. He ignores her. They keep going. The forest seems to press closer and closer until it feels like they are driving through a tunnel of damp, rotting wood. They stop once so Jason can check the trunk, convinced something is rattling loose. Emily gets out too and looks around. The woods are silent in that heavy, suffocating way that makes her ears ring. She feels dizzy and has to put a hand on the car to steady herself. Jason slams the trunk and tells her to get back in. She snaps that they should turn around, but he claims it is too tight and they would just get stuck. He gets behind the wheel and waits until she grudgingly follows. They slam the doors and sit breathing hard, fogging the windows. Jason puts the car in gear. The road continues forward. As afternoon edges toward evening, they admit they are lost. Jason grips the wheel so tight his knuckles whiten. Emily holds the map like it is some sacred text, but it offers no answers. The woods all look the same. The trail winds back on itself, splitting in ways that make no sense. They stop at one junction and see 3 paths instead of 2, none marked, all equally uninviting. Jason chooses one at random. Emily bites her lip until it bleeds. Neither wants to admit how scared they are now. The adventure has curdled into something sharp and sour. They finally stop on a rise where the trees thin just enough to see the pale sky stretching out in all directions. Emily gets out and breathes deeply, fighting tears. Jason leans against the hood and refuses to meet her gaze. She says they should just camp here again, wait for morning, hope to see something familiar in the daylight. He shakes his head, insisting they can make out tonight. She says nothing. They get back in and keep driving. The light bleeds away until the world outside the headlights is pure black, the trees transformed into tall, faceless sentinels. Jason is the one who finally admits they need to stop. The Subaru coughs and sputters as he kills the engine. They sit in the silence, so thick it seems to press on their chests. Emily whispers that she is sorry. Jason puts his head in his hands. They do not know where they are. They do not know if they can even find the way back. The wind picks up, sliding cold fingers through the cracks in the windows. Emily shivers, and Jason finally reaches over to hold her hand. Neither speaks again. They listen to the wind and the settling ticks of the cooling engine. When morning comes, they are both stiff and miserable, but at least alive. Jason tries the engine, and it grumbles to life. Emily rubs her eyes, trying to shake off dreams that were nothing but endless trees. They drive slowly, nervously, watching for anything familiar. But the road seems to shift around them, each turn revealing another just like it. The forest is endless. Jason swears under his breath while Emily grips her camera like it is a talisman. They keep going because there is nothing else to do. They keep going because stopping feels like admitting they will never get out. Morning rises with a dull, colorless sky that promises no warmth as Emily rubs her eyes and peers through the fogged windshield. The car is quiet except for Jason's shallow breathing. Neither slept well, their bodies cramped and sore from the uneven ground beneath the seats. He mutters that they need to try again to find a road out before it gets worse. She nods slowly, her voice a rasp as she says they should try retracing their path. He agrees with a defeated sigh and starts the engine, which coughs before settling into a low idle. The sound is strangely comforting, the one thing that still feels under control in a place that seems determined to confuse them. They move forward cautiously, scanning the trees for any sign of the way they came, but every turn looks the same as the last, the same thickets, and the same fallen logs. Emily grips the map even though it has become useless, the lines worn and creased from her anxious fingers. She tries to compare the crooked lines with the vague shapes of the ridges rising around them, but sees no match. Jason keeps glancing at her like he wants to say something, but does not want to fight again. Instead, he mutters to himself about how stupid this was, about how they should have stuck to the state park campsites with their picnic tables and clearings marked by little wooden posts. She does not argue. She feels that way too, that regret clinging like damp clothes. The silence between them grows thick as they roll forward over roots and ruts that make the car rock like a ship in rough water. They come to a wider clearing, the first real space in hours of creeping through green walls. Emily begs him to stop so she can get out and stretch her legs. Jason pulls over and shuts the engine off reluctantly. They step outside, and immediately the cold bites them. wind slipping between trees with a sound like whispered warnings. Emily shivers and wraps her arms around herself, while Jason checks the tires and runs a hand through his hair. He curses when he sees the gas gauge, which has dropped lower than either realized. They both know they have wasted precious fuel getting nowhere. She suggests they wait for someone to come by, but he shakes his head grimly. No one comes here. They chose it for that very reason. She pulls out her phone and holds it up, pacing in slow circles while watching for a signal. Nothing. Jason does the same with equal futility. He punches the air once, frustration leaking out, then sighs and rests his hands on his hips. Emily takes a photo without thinking, the lens capturing him silhouetted against the pale sky, looking small and lost. When he sees the flash, he barks at her to stop. She lowers the camera and looks away, biting her lip to keep from crying. He exhales and mutters an apology, too tired to fight properly anymore. They both know they are not angry at each other, but at the creeping realization that they are in real trouble. They decide to keep moving, thinking motion is better than sitting in place waiting for the night to come again. Jason drives slowly, the car laboring over ground that was never meant for vehicles. Branches scrape the doors and stones clack under the chassis. Emily stares out the window, watching the gray light slide through tangled branches like dying embers. The road, or what is left of it, splits in confusing ways. 2 paths here, 3 there, all equally ruined and overgrown. Jason picks at random sometimes, trying to keep to what seems like downhill, muttering that water flows out, and so will the roads. It is nonsense, but it is something to say. They start seeing signs of human passage in old, decaying forms. Rusted cans at the base of a tree. A rotted wooden sign whose paint has peeled away in strips. A circle of stones that once held a fire, but now cradle wet leaves. Jason says that means someone has been here. Emily whispers that it also means they left. She takes another photo, not sure why, maybe to document they were here in case they never leave. The camera clicks like a nervous tick. Jason rolls his eyes, but says nothing, focusing on not getting them stuck. After hours that seem like days, they finally see something that makes them stop cold. Ahead on the trail, a vehicle sits half hidden by brush, its faded color blending with the browns and greens. Jason slows, squinting. Emily grips his arm reflexively. It is an old truck, rust eating the wheel wells, tires flat and rotting. Moss climbs the hood like eager fingers. They get out, stepping carefully around muddy ruts to look. The doors hang open. Inside, the seats are shredded by time and animals. Nothing personal remains. No bags, no bottles, no sign of who once drove it. Jason swears softly. Emily takes a photo, the flash bleaching the wreckage into harsh white angles. She feels sick. They do not talk about what it means as they get back into their own car. Jason starts the engine with shaking hands. Emily stares at the truck until the trees swallow it behind them. Neither says the word trapped, but it hangs in the air between them like the taste of something rotten. They keep driving until the light fades, and they realize they will not find the way out tonight either. Jason suggests they camp in the car again. Emily nods, too tired to argue. They eat granola bars in silence, chewing slowly in the dark, listening to the wind pressing against the windows like something begging to be let in. They talk briefly about trying to walk out in the morning, leaving the car behind to save gas. Jason says it is risky, that they could get lost on foot even easier. Emily agrees, but says they may have no choice. They fall silent again, listening to the cold tick of a cooling engine. She leans her head against the window, feeling it suck the warmth from her skin. Jason rubs his hands together until the friction burns. Outside, the woods settle around them, patient, waiting, unblinking. They close their eyes, but do not sleep, not really. When the first rays of dawn scrape across the canopy, Emily wakes, with her neck stiff against the door. She blinks at the condensation-smeared glass that turns the forest outside into a green blur. Jason is slumped over the wheel, breathing shallowly, his eyes crusted with exhaustion. They speak little as they straighten themselves and rub their faces, the taste of stale granola still on their tongues. The air in the car is sour with sweat and anxiety. Jason starts the engine out of habit rather than hope, listening to the reluctant cough before it catches. The needle hovers over empty, but not quite at the bottom yet. He mutters that they can make it a little further. Emily says nothing but grips the map again, though they both know it has betrayed them. They roll forward slowly, their eyes scanning the road for any sign that it is leading them back to civilization. Jason drives with rigid focus, leaning forward so far his nose nearly touches the glass. Emily leans against her window, watching the trees as they slide by like slow waves of green and brown. She takes another photo, not even looking at the frame. The camera whines as it processes the image. Jason glances at her with an unreadable expression, but does not say anything. Their words have dried up in the press of fear. The road seems to narrow even more, roots cracking the dirt and scraping the undercarriage with teeth-gritting regularity. They come around a bend and stop abruptly. The path is blocked by fallen trees and a thick mat of brambles, as if the forest has decided to reclaim the road in their absence. Jason curses under his breath and pounds the wheel. Emily stares at the blockage, blinking back tears. She suggests they try to backtrack, but they both remember the confusing splits and false turns. Jason sighs heavily and runs a hand over his face, leaving streaks of grime. He says they will try to find another way, a side path, or even a clearing big enough to turn around. Emily nods without conviction. The car creeps backward until Jason can edge it onto a smaller trail they had ignored before, one that looks like it was meant for ATVs or foot traffic rather than anything with four wheels. They follow this path for what feels like hours. The light changes above them as the sun rises behind dense clouds, turning the world to a pale, unfriendly silver. Jason keeps glancing at the fuel gauge, watching it sink like a stone. Emily grips the door handle and braces herself every time the car jolts over a root or dips into a muddy rut. She tries to keep her breathing slow, measured, counting each inhale and exhale. The smell of damp earth filters in through the cracked windows, mixing with gasoline fumes and their own sour sweat. They are too tired to argue now. Every movement is deliberate, every choice weighed with the knowledge that they have little left to spare. At last they see something ahead, a small clearing where the trees open enough for pale light to pool. Jason lets out a breath he has been holding and steers them toward it. But as they break through the last of the undergrowth, they stop dead. In the middle of the clearing sits their own campsite gear, the tent collapsed and twisted, the sleeping bags matted with damp leaves, the empty water bottles scattered like bones. Emily covers her mouth with her hand as she realizes what this means. They have not found a new path. They have come back to where they started. Jason swears and bangs his fist on the wheel, so hard Emily jumps. The woods have circled them in on themselves. They get out, leaving the doors open. Emily walks unsteadily to the wreckage of their campsite, kicking through the ruined sleeping bags. She picks up a crushed granola wrapper with trembling fingers. Jason stands behind her, arms crossed tightly over his chest, glaring at the trees as if daring them to move. He says nothing. She drops the wrapper and looks at him, her face wet with tears she cannot remember starting. She asks what they do now, and he shakes his head slowly. She sits down in the dirt and buries her face in her hands. Jason does not comfort her. He looks at the car, the last piece of civilization in this indifferent green prison, and seems to weigh whether it is worth even trying anymore. After a long silence, they force themselves back into the car. Jason turns the key and listens to the engine sputter, threatening to die but clinging to life. He reverses slowly, wheels chewing into soft earth, and turns the car onto another directionless trail. Emily watches her ruined campsite fade behind them until the trees swallow it completely. Neither speaks. The silence feels like a third passenger pressing them both into their seats. They keep going until the car begins to cough and hesitate, the gas finally giving out with a series of sick-sounding sputters. Jason coasts to the side of the trail and kills the engine. He rests his forehead against the wheel. Emily leans back and closes her eyes. The wind picks up outside, rustling the canopy with dry whispers. The car cools quickly, the heat they built up with movement draining away like blood from a wound. Emily rubs her arms for warmth, teeth chattering slightly. Jason sits upright slowly, blinking in the dull light. He says they will walk. Emily does not answer at first, then nods. She opens her door and stands, feeling her knees protest. Jason shoulders their last full water bottle and the small pack with the camera and map. He says they will follow the trail as far as it goes and hope it leads somewhere. She steps next to him, clutching the camera like it can see the way out. They walk slowly, boots sinking into soft mud, feet dragging over tangled roots. The trees lean in on all sides, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers above. The trail seems to stretch forever ahead of them, a single line of churned earth cutting through green shadow. Emily breathes heavily, each step an act of will. Jason stays ahead by a few feet, checking back every so often to make sure she is still following. They speak little, their words eaten by the hush of the woods. The wind sighs overhead, moving the canopy in long, restless waves. Somewhere behind them the car sits quiet, empty, its metal cooling in the indifferent air. They begin walking along the narrow trail with a weak gray sky overhead casting everything in a dull, lifeless light. Emily keeps one hand wrapped around the camera while the other grips the strap of the pack that digs into her shoulder. Jason carries the last water bottle, half full and sloshing with every step. Their boots sink into the muddy patches that have formed from days of cold drizzle, sucking at their feet as if the forest wants to hold them in place. They move slowly, each step an act of stubbornness, the hush of the woods pressing against their ears. The only sounds come from the creak of branches and the slow shush of the wind sliding between tree trunks. They do not speak at first. Emily concentrates on the rhythm of her breathing, fighting the tightness in her chest. She watches Jason's back, the way his shoulders tense and relax with every pace, his head turning slightly as if listening for something. The path seems to narrow the farther they go, the brush scraping their arms, snagging at clothing already damp and dirty. They pass signs of old use, rusted metal scraps half buried in dirt, the remains of wooden fencing collapsing into moss and leaf litter. Jason mutters that someone once lived here, but offers no hope that they might still. Emily just nods, unwilling to waste words. As morning turns to afternoon, they stop to rest on a fallen log slick with rain and rot. Jason unscrews the water bottle and hands it to her first. She takes small measured sips, feeling the cold liquid trickle down her dry throat. He watches her before taking his own drink, careful to save some for later. Neither of them knows how far they have gone or how much farther they need to go. The path twists in on itself, doubling back without warning, splitting into smaller game trails that look identical. Emily wipes her mouth with the back of her hand and stares into the tangled green ahead. Jason rubs his temples and breathes through his nose, fighting panic that tastes like bile. They rise stiffly and continue, stepping over roots that snake across the trail like bones. The canopy above thickens, darkening the world below, until even midday feels like twilight. The cold air grows damp, seeping through their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Emily shivers uncontrollably at times, hugging herself until Jason offers a hand to steady her. She takes it with numb fingers, and they walk like that for a while, connected by shared desperation more than affection. Jason keeps scanning the edges of the path, looking for anything that suggests an exit, a sign, a structure. But the forest offers only itself, silent and unyielding. They come to a place where the path forks three ways, each route equally overgrown and unmarked. Jason stares at them for a long moment, jaw working silently as if he wants to scream. Emily watches his face, the muscles in his neck tight with frustration. He finally chooses the leftmost trail without discussion, simply moving forward with grim determination. Emily hesitates before following. She lifts her camera and snaps another photo, the flash briefly illuminating the endless green. It feels pointless, but she cannot stop herself. The camera is the only proof she has left that they existed here at all. As they walk, Emily starts to feel lightheaded. She stumbles once, nearly falling before Jason grabs her arm. He shakes her gently, his eyes wide with worry that he tries to hide. She assures him she is fine, but her voice sounds thin even to her own ears. She has not eaten in hours, and the meager water rations are doing little to help. Jason suggests they rest again, but she insists on moving, afraid of stopping, afraid of never getting up if she sits again. They trudge on, feet dragging, breath misting in the cold. The silence between them grows oppressive, filled with words they are too tired to say. At some point the path fades to nothing, swallowed by undergrowth and fallen branches. Jason stops, looking around in disbelief. He kicks at a clump of ferns and curses under his breath. Emily watches him, tears welling in her eyes. She blinks them away quickly, refusing to let them fall. She lifts the camera again, takes a picture of Jason standing alone in the ruined trail, his figure hunched and defeated. He turns on her angrily, asking why she keeps doing that. She answers that someone has to remember. He softens immediately, all the fight draining from him. He steps toward her and rests his forehead against hers. They turn back reluctantly, trying to find the last split in the path, but everything looks the same. They circle in slow, exhausted loops, moving like sleepwalkers through the underbrush. Emily scratches her arms on thorns, not even reacting to the sting. Jason breathes heavily, voice cracking when he calls out for help that he knows will never come. The forest swallows the sound with greedy silence. The sky above darkens as clouds gather, promising rain that neither of them can face. Emily grips his hand with icy fingers, refusing to let go even as they stumble over roots and rocks. They find themselves back at the three-way split eventually, confirmation that they have gone nowhere. Jason collapses onto the ground, dirt streaking his clothes. Emily stands for a moment before sinking beside him, her legs no longer willing to hold her. They sit in silence, the camera resting on her knees, the water bottle nearly empty beside them. Jason stares at the dirt, unblinking, while Emily closes her eyes and listens to the wind sighing through the leaves. She counts her breaths slowly, imagining what it would be like to lie down and sleep forever. Jason reaches over and grips her wrist gently, grounding her, reminding her that they are still alive, still fighting even if they do not know why. The search began in earnest when Emily and Jason did not return on Monday as promised. Their families called them repeatedly, each call dropping straight to voicemail. At first, there was cautious hope that they had simply lost track of time or that the lack of service in the hills was to blame. By Tuesday, the hope twisted into worry. Friends they had spoken to before leaving confirmed they had planned only a short weekend trip. Emily's mother drove the old roads toward the trailhead, hoping to see the Subaru parked somewhere obvious, her eyes scanning every turnout and pull-off in the failing light. She returned home that night empty-handed, her hands shaking on the wheel as she tried to think of what to do next. By Wednesday, local police were involved, taking statements from family and friends. Officers walked the roads with dogs, leaning into the wind as it cut across the ridges, calling their names into a silence that swallowed sound. Helicopters hovered over dense green expanses, rotors chopping the air while spotters scanned for any sign of movement or bright camping gear. Volunteers arrived with backpacks and printed maps that quickly became damp and smeared in the persistent drizzle. They moved in slow lines through brambles and knee-high grass, calling out, listening for any human sound. The woods offered nothing. It was as if the trees themselves had closed over Emily and Jason, hiding them away from the world. The Subaru was finally found deep along a barely marked logging road that was more ditch than path. The hazard lights were dead and the battery was drained. The doors were unlocked, the seats covered with stray leaves and damp dirt tracked in by boots. Emily's camera sat on the passenger seat, turned off, its memory card full of photos of green tunnels, Jason's tight-lipped face behind the wheel, and the washed-out shapes of trails that went nowhere. The last photo was an accidental blur, a flash of white light in a wall of black. It told the searchers nothing. Police examined the car carefully. There was no sign of violence. The windshield was unbroken, the tires flattened only by time. The gas tank was bone dry. The maps inside were marked with pencil lines showing possible routes out, each crossed off in frustration. Food wrappers and water bottles littered the back seat. Volunteers stared at the car with hollow eyes, realizing it was both a clue and a dead end. Search dogs circled the area, noses to the ground, but the rain and wind had scoured away any scent. Every path split and twisted, looping back on itself like a cruel trick. The forest felt endless and ancient, indifferent to human fear. News spread quickly through the small community. Local papers printed grainy photos of Emily and Jason smiling at birthday parties, standing in front of their apartment building, leaning against that same battered Subaru when it still held the promise of adventure. Family members gave interviews on porches and in living rooms, clutching framed photographs with white knuckles, their voices trembling as they begged for help. Strangers dropped off casseroles and envelopes of cash to help pay for private search teams. A neighbor printed hundreds of flyers and stapled them to telephone poles and gas station bulletin boards across the county. The photos faded in the rain. As weeks turned to months, the search effort changed shape. Official patrols slowed. The command center in the church basement was packed away. Volunteers stopped showing up in regular shifts. The flyers were taken down or replaced by newer tragedies. The case was marked inactive in the county records, the file stuffed into a drawer. Private investigators came and went, taking money and reporting back that the forest was too big, too wild, too good at keeping its secrets. Emily's mother stayed up nights staring at old photos, listening to voicemails where Emily laughed about work gossip. Jason's brother drank too much and lashed out at friends who tried to comfort him. Rumors started to spread, as they always do. Some said they had run off together, unable to face city life. Others said they had stumbled on something they were not supposed to see, whispers of old moonshine stills or remote cabins with unkind owners. A few claimed the forest was cursed, that anyone who wandered off the main trails would be swallowed whole. These stories hurt the families most of all. They knew Emily and Jason. They knew the two of them would never abandon their lives, their families, their responsibilities. But without bodies, there was no proof. Without proof, there was no closure. Years passed like slow water wearing down stone. The forest grew over any tracks or signs that had been left. The logging roads decayed further, trees falling across them in heavy green barricades. Animals nested in the abandoned Subaru until someone finally towed it away at the county's insistence. The spot where it sat became just another bend in an unmarked trail. Hunters and hikers passed by without knowing what had happened there, stepping over flattened grass that had once been a staging ground for desperate searches. The wind sighed through the trees, telling no one what it had seen. Emily's mother sold the apartment where Emily had lived, unable to stand the empty room with its stacks of books and the unwashed coffee mug by the sink. She moved closer to her sister in a neighboring state, telling people she wanted a fresh start. Jason's brother cleaned out Jason's belongings in one long brutal day, stuffing clothes into garbage bags, keeping only the beat-up guitar they had shared since high school. He stored it in his own closet and tried to forget. On anniversaries of their disappearance, friends posted old photos on social media, tagging them with pleas for information that no one could answer. The comments filled with condolences and then fell silent. The case sat in the cold files at the county sheriff's office, a thin envelope of photocopied maps and witness statements. Deputies who had walked those trails transferred or retired. The new ones glanced at the file only when asked, shaking their heads at the tragedy and the futility of it all. Eventually, no one asked anymore. The forest went back to its quiet business, letting the seasons turn without witness. Leaves fell and rotted, new ones sprouted in their place. The paths disappeared entirely in places erased by time and rain. 8 years passed with nothing but silence before anything changed. It was autumn when 2 local men loaded their old pickup truck with cutting equipment and empty scrap bins. They had heard there was abandoned mining equipment deeper in the forest, where the old coal companies had once dug exploratory shafts decades ago. These men were not looking for adventure or trouble, just a few dollars worth of metal to sell in town. They drove slowly along the old roads, weaving around fallen branches and deep ruts, the tires bouncing in potholes, filled with rainwater. They passed places where the forest had swallowed the track entirely, forcing them to reverse and try another route. Eventually, they stopped at a spot where the trees opened up just enough for the gray light to pool on churned dirt. Ahead of them sat the black mouth of an old mine entrance, half choked with debris and vines. The men got out and walked forward cautiously, boots sinking in soft, wet ground. The air smelled of cold stone and rotting leaves. One of them grumbled that it was not worth it, that there was probably nothing left inside. The other reminded him they had driven all morning and might as well check. They peered into the gloom, trying to see past the tangled roots and old timbers that had collapsed across the opening. They noticed the entrance had been covered with a heavy steel door, not something standard for old mines. It was a large sheet of rusted metal bolted into place and then welded along the edges, the seams blackened and warped by the heat of the torch. Piles of rocks and old beams leaned against it, almost artfully placed to hide the work. The men exchanged glances. One of them muttered that it was strange. Mines were usually left open or sealed with concrete and warning signs. This looked like someone had tried to hide something quickly, even desperately. They kicked at the rocks, revealing the warped edge of the metal sheet, rust flaking under their boots. They decided the door itself was worth money. They hauled their gas-powered cutter from the truck bed and set up, the engine sputtering to life and spitting fumes into the crisp air. Sparks flew as they cut along the welds, the sound harsh and unnatural in the quiet of the forest. Birds flew from nearby branches at the noise. It took hours to slice a wide enough hole to crawl through. The men wiped sweat from their foreheads with dirty sleeves, stepping back to admire their work. The dark gap they had created yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. One of them shone a flashlight inside, the beam catching dust motes swirling in cold, stale air. They hesitated at the threshold. The air that rolled out was heavy and sour, unmoving for years. The smell of mold and damp earth was thick enough to choke on. They leaned in, sweeping the beam side to side. The walls were bare stone, rough and unlined. Debris littered the floor, old timbers fallen and half-rotted. The shaft was not deep at first, a short tunnel that opened into a small chamber maybe 15 feet across. The men exchanged a nervous laugh about horror stories and murder scenes, but neither wanted to be the first to step in. Finally, one ducked through the hole, boots crunching on loose gravel. The other followed close behind, keeping the light steady. Inside, the air was dead. Even their breathing sounded too loud, echoing back in shallow rasps. The light swept the walls, picking out old graffiti scrawled in faded paint, rusted nails protruding like broken teeth. The floor was littered with beer cans and cigarette butts, evidence that kids had used it for dares decades earlier. But toward the far end of the chamber, something stopped them cold. In the circle of light, they saw two shapes slumped against the back wall. At first they thought it was trash, mannequins maybe left by pranksters. But as they walked closer, they saw the fabric clinging to dried-out limbs, the hollow eye sockets staring into nothing. They froze, unable to look away. The two bodies were seated side by side, heads tilted slightly toward one another, backs propped against the stone wall, as if they had simply chosen to sit and rest forever. Their clothes were faded and torn, but recognizable as outdoor gear. One boot had fallen off, lying on its side a few feet away. The hands of one were curled loosely on a knee, skin drawn tight over bone in grotesque preservation. The other had collapsed inward more fully, the ribs visible through shrunken fabric. The air was dry enough to mummify them, preserving every detail in brutal clarity. Neither man spoke for a long moment. The flashlight beam wavered as one of them realized he was shaking. He swallowed hard and took a step back, bumping into his partner. They stared in silence until one found his voice cracking and hoarse. He insisted they leave immediately. They scrambled back through the hole they had cut, falling into the cold outside air with gasping breaths. They did not look at each other as they stumbled to the truck. One fumbled for the keys with clumsy fingers, cursing under his breath. The other kept checking over his shoulder as if expecting the corpses to follow them out. They drove until they found a spot with a cell signal. They sat there in the truck for a long time, staring at their phones, trying to decide who would make the call. Eventually, one dialed 911 with shaking hands, voice cracking as he described what they had found. The dispatcher fell silent before asking for the location. They gave the best directions they could, naming landmarks no one in the city would recognize. The call ended and they sat there in the quiet cab, the sound of their own breathing loud in their ears. Neither spoke for a long while. When the sheriff's department arrived the next morning with state police in tow, the site was easy to find thanks to the cut metal door. The officers stood around the opening, breathing in the sharp metallic smell of the welding cuts and the older, fouler scent of decay. They sent in their own people, suited and masked, who emerged pale and shaken. Word spread quickly through the county that the missing couple had been found. Families were notified with quiet, careful words chosen to hurt as little as possible. DNA testing was almost unnecessary, but done anyway to satisfy procedure. Emily and Jason had been found at last, but the discovery brought no relief, only new questions. The county coroner received the bodies under bright fluorescent lights that made everything look even starker than the grim scene in the mine. Carefully, with the solemnity of someone who had done this too many times, they cataloged every item of clothing and every trace of evidence clinging to the remains. Emily's faded hiking pants had torn at the knees. Jason's shirt was stained and stiff with age and dirt. The boots were cracked and brittle from years of neglect. Their belongings, such as they were, offered no clues beyond proof they had dressed for the woods and had not changed or been redressed. There was no sign of violence on the clothes themselves. No cuts, no tears suggesting weapons or defensive wounds. The first examination of the remains revealed something that deepened the horror for everyone involved. Both Emily and Jason had multiple fractures in their lower legs, old breaks that had healed not at all in the intervening years. Their tibias and fibulas were cracked in messy lines that suggested a traumatic fall. The feet themselves showed smaller fractures consistent with a heavy impact. The coroner traced the breaks with a gloved finger and shook their head slowly. These injuries would have been agonizing, making walking impossible. Both would have been immobilized almost immediately. It was no wonder they were found sitting, backs against the wall, positioned in such a chillingly quiet way. What puzzled the coroner even more was the absence of other major injuries. No damage to the skulls, no broken arms suggesting they had tried to catch themselves in a fall, no defensive wounds at all. It was as though they had dropped straight down with no warning. Careful measurement of the injuries led the medical examiner to estimate a fall of perhaps 20 feet, maybe more, depending on the angle. The idea formed slowly and terribly in everyone's mind that Emily and Jason had not walked into the mine at all, but fallen into it from above. As this possibility took shape, the investigation returned to the site with grim determination. Law enforcement, now motivated by the shift from a missing person case to potential homicide, secured the area around the mine with bright tape that fluttered in the wind. Investigators used portable lights to examine the shaft in full. Dust hung in the air, dancing in pale beams as officers and specialists crouched and pointed. One of them climbed a narrow vertical shaft above the chamber, finding the surface partially blocked by old boards and overgrown with roots. The boards were rotted, but clearly had once covered the shaft. This was not a natural sinkhole or collapse. It was a man-made trap, or, at the very least, a hazard someone had tried to hide poorly. Emily and Jason had likely stumbled onto it in the dark or while distracted with their argument or panic. The weight of two adults would have been enough to break through the brittle wood. They would have plunged into the shaft, smashing their legs on the stone floor below. There, unable to stand, they could only crawl a few feet, dragging themselves in pain to the wall where they were found. The investigation teams imagined them calling for help, voices bouncing in the darkness, met only by the cold indifference of earth and rock. The knowledge settled over the officers like damp fog, heavy and unshakable. Forensic teams found no signs that the pair had been murdered in the conventional sense. No knives, no guns, no rope. But questions remained that refused to lie still. who had welded the mine doors shut from the outside, sealing them in forever. The sheet metal had been applied roughly but effectively, the seams melted and pressed into the rock with clear signs of a handheld torch. It was not old. It was not from the original mining days. Someone had come after Emily and Jason fell, after they had crawled as far as they could and closed the entrance with grim purpose. Investigators scraped samples from the welds, hoping for some trace of the equipment used or the person who had done it. Evidence was sparse. Years of rain, heat, and cold had scoured the site clean. Rust stained everything, obscuring details. Soil samples were taken for analysis, in the slim hope of finding anything unique. The searchers fanned out through the surrounding woods, looking for old campsites, for paths leading to hidden cabins, for any sign of someone who might have lived close enough to know the mine intimately. They found remains of old hunting blinds, crumbling shacks used by loggers long gone, and trash heaps marked with rusted cans and shattered bottles, but nothing that screamed culpability. The forest was good at hiding things. The small town watched in morbid fascination as news spread. The local paper ran headlines that balanced tragedy and scandal. The evening news interviewed neighbors and old friends who spoke in hushed, respectful tones about Emily's easy laugh and Jason's fierce loyalty. Candlelight vigils were held in the town square, with people holding printed photos from the old missing person flyers, now wrinkled and faded. Emily's mother returned for the first time in years, standing in the crowd with her eyes fixed on the candles, flickering like hope fighting against the wind. Jason's brother stood a few feet away, jaw clenched, hands stuffed in his pockets, as if he did not trust them not to shake. The county sheriff held press conferences where he tried to sound confident, promising answers. He explained the fractures in quiet, careful language, described the welding as deliberate, spoke about the vertical shaft that should have been blocked off properly decades ago. He did not call it murder outright, but he did not shy away from calling it suspicious. Reporters pushed for details. Who would have welded the door? Why was no one checking these abandoned mines? Who was responsible for letting it happen? The sheriff paused before each answer, choosing words with care so as not to promise too much. Behind closed doors, the investigation shifted focus. They requested old land records, searching for leases and ownership documents for the land around the mine. They began building a list of locals who had worked in logging or small-scale mining, anyone who might have owned equipment capable of welding in such a remote spot. Deputies quietly asked around about hermits or loners, people who did not like strangers on their land. They visited old-timers who sat on sagging porches, listening to them ramble about the old days, and the people who had moved deeper into the hills to avoid taxes, regulations, and neighbors alike. The questions spread like ripples through the small community, unsettling everyone. When investigators finally found a lead, it came not from some dramatic confession, but from slow, relentless checking of records that had sat untouched for years. In the county office, where dust coated file folders, like a second skin, they located an old lease for a section of land that included the mine entrance. It had been signed over decades earlier to a man who claimed to be conducting geological surveys. No one had checked on him in years because no one cared much about those remote hills except for the families who had lost something there. Deputies paid a visit to the address listed on the lease. It was a sagging house on a patch of weedy land where an old truck sat on cinder blocks and a thin column of smoke rose from a rusty barrel. The man who answered the door was in his 60s with leathery skin and cold, watchful eyes. He wore old work clothes stained with grease and smelled like oil and tobacco. They asked him about the mine. He squinted at them like he was deciding whether to bother answering. He said he knew about it, but had not been there in years. When asked if he had ever welded the entrance, he shrugged and claimed people were always trespassing and making a mess. He admitted he might have sealed it years back to keep kids out. The deputies exchanged looks at the casual way he spoke. One asked if he remembered seeing anyone trapped inside. He snorted at that suggestion and said if someone had been in there, it was not his fault. He added that anyone dumb enough to be exploring an old mine deserved what they got. The deputies left with his words in their notebooks and a sour taste in their mouths. They returned with a warrant the next week. They went through the shed behind his house, which was filled with rusting tools and half-finished projects. Hanging on a nail was an old welding mask. In a corner sat an acetylene tank with the regulator still attached and a torch resting on top of a pile of scrap metal. A quick glance revealed it had been used recently enough to keep the seals from cracking entirely in the weather. In a drawer inside the house, they found a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper that showed the mine layout in remarkable detail, including the vertical shaft that Emily and Jason had fallen through and the side entrance that had been welded shut. The marks on the paper suggested someone who knew the terrain intimately. When confronted with the evidence, the man did not break down in tears or beg for forgiveness. He told them in a flat voice that he had lived on that land for decades and did not want people messing around his property. He admitted that he heard voices once down in the mine and that he walked to the entrance and saw them trapped. He claimed they were yelling for help, but he did not want to deal with them. He said they were not his responsibility and he did not invite them onto his land. When asked if he welded the entrance shut while they were still inside, he nodded slowly like he was admitting to something as minor as forgetting to take out the trash. He argued that they should not have been there, and if they died it was their own fault. The trial did not last long once the story became public. Prosecutors described the injuries that made escape impossible and the sealed door that turned the mine into a tomb. Witnesses cried on the stand when they spoke about the search parties years earlier and the moment the abandoned car was found deep in the woods with the hazard lights clicking away into darkness. Emily's mother testified with shaking hands, holding a photo of her daughter as a little girl standing in a field of sunflowers. Jason's brother spoke in a low, hoarse voice about the way they used to play music together on the porch in the summer. The defense tried to argue it was trespassing and that the deaths were tragic accidents, but the jury did not accept that sealing two people in to starve and die was anything but deliberate cruelty. The judge read the verdict slowly to a silent courtroom. The man was sentenced for intentional neglect leading to death. He would serve 18 years in prison. He did not react when the sentence was read. He did not look at anyone in the gallery, where Emily's mother sat with her head bowed and Jason's brother stared with empty eyes at the floor. Reporters wrote stories about the case that spread far beyond the small town. Headlines described a slow-motion killing in a forgotten mine and asked how such a thing could happen in modern America. Comment sections filled with outrage and sorrow and people wondering how many other places like that existed in the quiet, dark corners of the country. Emily and Jason were buried side by side in the small cemetery on the edge of town. The service was held under a sky that threatened rain, but never delivered more than a thin, cold mist. Family and friends gathered in coats and scarves, standing in circles around the graves, as the pastor spoke about memory and forgiveness. Emily's mother wept openly, clutching a folded letter Emily had written to her, once promising she would always come back home no matter how far she traveled. Jason's brother held onto the old guitar. They had shared fingers pressing grooves into the wood so hard his knuckles went white. People who had helped search all those years ago stood in silence, their faces older and lined with years of wondering what happened. They placed small tokens on the casket's pine cones, stones, photographs, printed on cheap glossy paper. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of wind rattling through bare branches overhead. The pastor spoke about grace and the need to remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived. He asked the gathered to hold on to the moments of laughter and warmth the way Emily always saw beauty in old broken places, and the way Jason could make anyone laugh even on the worst days. When the last words were said and the crowd began to drift away, Emily's mother stayed behind, pressing her palm flat to the cold wood of the casket, as if trying to memorize the shape of it. Jason's brother sat on the grass, nearby, the guitar resting across his knees. He hummed tunelessly into the cold air, eyes shut tight against the tears. They stayed like that for a long time until the caretaker gently touched their shoulders and reminded them the gates would be closing soon. They walked out together, slowly, the path muddy under their feet, the graves behind them marked by fresh, turned earth and two simple wooden crosses. The town carried the memory forward. In the years that followed, the old mine was filled in, and the road that led to it was blocked with earth and timbers. No one wanted to see it again. The county put up warning signs all along the forest edge, reminding travelers to stay on marked trails and to tell someone where they were going. Newcomers who asked about the story were told with quiet voices and solemn faces that it was better not to forget the price of carelessness and cruelty. Schools taught children to respect the woods, to understand that wild places could be beautiful but also dangerous. But memory is stubborn. Emily's mother kept a small photo on her kitchen windowsill showing Emily and Jason sitting on the hood of that Subaru, arms wrapped around each other, the mountains rolling green behind them. Jason's brother played the guitar on his porch in summer evenings, sometimes humming a tune he never finished. People who had known them would smile sadly and shake their heads when they heard it, remembering two people who just wanted to get away from it all for a weekend and found instead the terrible weight of being lost. If you found this story meaningful or thought-provoking, I would love to hear what you think about it. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below about the plot and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice helps keep these conversations alive.